So there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about when it comes to Tim Gilchrist Jr. From Waterford, who was handed down 11 years in prison for his role in this flying drugs into the country. So the first thing is a bit ridiculous, but when you hear his story that these guys called to the door and said to him, "You're going to fly in a plane," that sounds like one of my dreams.
It doesn't. In which a nightmare or a dream?
No, a dream. It's such an unrealistic story, isn't it? That it would be real if you were asleep and your dream, and two men just arrived at your door and said, "You're going to fly in a plane," and you'd go,
or else,
and you'd go, "Okay," and then you'd fly in a plane, and there would happen to be €8 million worth of cocaine.
Well, it's funny dreams you do be having is the first thing. But the second thing is, like, look, we said it so many times, but every time these drugs cases come to court, you could predict every single occasion it's going to be threats and intimidation that force the person to do it. That is always the excuse given. Often the guards...
Not the moolah,
not greed, not anything like that. And often the guards... The prosecuting guards, they don't necessarily become involved. In this case, the guard said he did not accept that was what happened, that he acted under threats and intimidation, which is kind of rare, because often once there's a conviction there, the guards will let the defence give their version of events, and they don't necessarily feel obliged to stand up and say, he's not a nice guy. But on this occasion, the guard, certainly when asked about it, made the point that he didn't accept that excuse. But he's a funny character, Tim Gilchrist, again. Like
described as a Walter Mitty character.
By his own defence again. But he certainly isn't somebody, he's a company director, he's described as well. He's not somebody from the mean streets of the ghetto. He seems to be a sort of middle-class businessman who doesn't have a history of criminality and has become involved in... Which is, that £8 million seizure was one of the biggest seizures of the year.
And that was 2 years ago, almost, when this plane at a private airfield in the Midlands was searched and the drugs were found. He was caught with the drugs in his car.
Yeah,
he had flown with this plane to France, and it had returned to this private
he had flown over to France on a commercial flight. He had met the pilot and met the people in the plane in France in the airfield, flown back to Ireland with them. Then they had landed in this, I certainly have never heard of it, but the Abbeyshrew Airdrome in County Longford, and unloaded the bags of cocaine, €8 million worth. I think it was even during one of the lockdown. Well, maybe it was just after, but it was certainly one of the biggest seizures of that year. Obviously, there's subsequently these massive seizures, but this, I think, points to a different type of cocaine smuggling. The cocaine was offloaded off the plane, put in an Alfa Romeo car, and at which point the guards intervened.
And of course, it came up in the case, and it certainly is the case, that a lot of these small private airports are suspected of being used to smuggle drugs. I suppose when cocaine started arriving here in Ireland, it was coming from Miami in the stomachs of drug mules. That was the beginning of it all, back in the sort of the 80s. And then obviously we saw, shipments of cocaine, bales of it landing up along the coast, where bigger shipments were being brought over in yachts across the Atlantic. Some of them went to Cropper. And in more recent years, every which way has been used to transport it.
I think
a lot of our coke kind of does come through those European ports of Antwerp and Rotterdam and makes its way over via land into Ireland. But this private air sort of method has been something certainly that the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau believe a number of outfits are using. And it's not something that a smaller outfit could afford.
No, but
These drugs, of course, were the families, suspected of being the families.
Yeah, the family being a West Dublin gang who've become probably, one of the most significant suppliers, certainly the most significant supplier of heroin in the country, and one of the most significant suppliers of cocaine. Like the light aircraft, like when the Colombian cartels first started that mass smuggling of cocaine it was light aircraft is what they used to fly from Colombia to the kind of the southern part of the States. In recent years, certainly in moving cocaine from South America to Europe, definitely the container ships have become the most common route because of the amount they can pack into it. But light aircraft certainly are there's just probably not being monitored as much. I mean, even the fact that obviously there was a situation in Western Airport previously in a plane owned by Jimmy Mansfield Sr., where a huge quantity of cocaine was taken off. And that case, a guy called John Kinsella was ultimately convicted. And you heard great details because the Dutch had kind of tapped, they had secret recordings of conversations. But if you look at this, £8 million worth of cocaine, I think it was 8.4 million in the end. If you were to fly a plane from France to Ireland, to hire that plane and to pay a number of staff and to bring it over, I'm not sure what it would cost you, but you're really talking about maybe a 5-figure sum, in the low 5 figures, maybe 10, 20,000. I don't know exactly.
I wouldn't have a clue how much that
but
would
you're
cost
talking about that really to hire one of those small aircraft and to hire people to fly it. I think it's Conor McGregor hired a plane for a day for 10, a private plane to travel to France on one occasion, I think for 10,000 a day. So that's what you're talking about, which is a big investment. And we've obviously had the kind of mule smugglers where the investment is smaller. Before to move £8 million worth of cocaine, it's only a drop in the ocean.
Gilchrist, my understanding was that he was an unknown as such, that the family organisation, it shows their reach and it shows their cunning, doesn't it? To use somebody like him, a 56-year-old who ends up agreeing to fly the stuff in and so it is to look as if he's this businessman. He sort of has some business interests in Uganda, but he's actually was a road maintenance worker. Yeah,
I mean, it's a funny, again, like you look for a trace of him in terms of social media and employment history, and he has this kind of odd movement, spending a long time in training courses in colleges on his LinkedIn, and then spending a significant amount of time in Uganda where he had some business interests. So really, I'd say one of these kind of drifter types who's
a sort of certainly a nobody when it came to the 100% the Gardaí as such. So this operation is that he is supposed to look as if he has hired this private plane to get him back home to Longford. His car is waiting and he's going to drive home to Waterford where he lives. That is the scenario. Of course, he didn't realise that this operation was under the surveillance of the Garda's Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau, and that he would get caught up in it. A courier with a very low role, his defence told the court, Michael O'Higgins, senior counsel. But nonetheless, he got 11 years for it. I mean, that is a long sentence.
Yeah, I mean, the judge obviously heard his defence's description of him as a Walter Mitty character and as kind of a low-level person who'd had no obvious signs of wealth. However, the judge gave him, because he described the episode as being at the upper range of offences, and he said that it was a grave incident, and that also that Gilchrist was obviously involved in the logistics of the operation, as opposed to being somebody who was solely a courier, somebody who solely drove a car. He clearly had knowledge and foresight of what was going on. But yeah, he had a good go at the private airfields. He said that they appeared to be used as an open corridor by organised crime gangs in which to import significant quantities of controlled drugs. And he said there was a clear and unequivocal need for significant upgrades in both security and customs examination checks. Because what we have had in the past, and I don't know what the state of play is in all of these airfields, but certainly in the past, a small aircraft could land in one of these places, and while there'd be flight logs and records of these planes landing, nobody's going through a security system where there's an automatic customs checks in each occasion.
There's I've certainly been in Weston, which, while it was in the ownership, maybe not of the Mansfields, I can't remember, maybe that was already out of their ownership, and I have flown from there in these small aircrafts. Have you been in one?
I haven't really been, no.
I'm never the better of it.
Yeah.
Absolutely never. Now, we would always have been just going to do some, I suppose this was pre-drones, I'm showing my age here, but we would have been photographing. In actual fact, at one point we were photographing the Mansfield properties from the air because you couldn't see anything from the ground. We went up along the coast and all the rest of it. But so you're in the back of this tiny little thing with your knees practically up to your chest. I wouldn't be great flying at the best time. I don't like to think about it when I'm on an aircraft, how the plane is holding up in the sky and all that. But this is just very raw. And then you have a giant, big, burly photographer in the front hanging out the window with cameras and everything. It is absolutely terrifying experience. Not pleasant. But my point is that we had gone up a few times and then you come back, you get off the plane and you just wander. Through. Sorry, Weston, if you've upgraded your security and whatever it is that you have to do under, I'm sure they all have to come under some sort of an umbrella and regulations. But certainly at the time I was there, you could just literally walk from the from the runway just straight through. Like there was nothing.
No, there's not some guy who's going through each bag as it comes off an aircraft, So, but there obviously is the facilities for customs officers to intervene if they have information.
But they probably should be doing that. Surely there should be customs checks, or there should be some security if it's coming from outside. Like if a small aircraft like what I was doing was leaving Weston flying overhead, you have to give your details of where you're intending to go, etc. But if a flight like this one, and Gilchrist boarded that Cessna light aircraft and flew to France in it before returning to Abbey-Shrule from this other private airport in France called Dieppe Airport, surely there has to be some sort of
you would have thought, you would have thought so, and obviously that's the point the judge made. He said there was no checks in between both of those stop-offs and take-offs. So it certainly looks like a sort of almost foolproof plan. I mean, you can imagine that this seizure is not come as a result of routine custom checks or people checking flight paths. You can imagine this comes as a result of confidential information. Let's be realistic.
And this is just private to private airport.
Yeah.
So private airport in France. It just seems so simple, doesn't it?
It does seem so simple. And
of course, earlier that year, there had been another incident where a flight had private aircraft had come into the country carrying drugs as well. And at that point, it was believed that those drugs were bought by a number of different groupings and that they had to pay up front for them in the hopes that it would land, which is a kind of a peculiar, curious way of operating. But that ultimately, those drugs were coming from the Kinahan organisation. What's left of the Kinahan organisation that still has an interest in Ireland and in bringing drugs in here. So it would be sort of lower members of it, but this was the route they had come up with, and that was seized. Those drugs were seized as well. So that was 2 in 1 year.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you can see as well with the family organisation, as they're known, that they have links with these criminal gangs operating in that sort of Germany and France. And they're a different route than maybe the super cartel figures who seem to have specialised in the logistics of moving things between the ports, involving people from Holland and that sort of area. Like the family definitely have different connections, and it was always said that they've links with these Turkish gangs. Turkish gangs obviously were historically the primary movers of heroin through Europe, coming through Afghanistan, but they also became involved in a lot of the cocaine as well. And but
that's fairly recent that they've become involved in the cocaine. They were definitely largely doing heroin, and I suppose over the years that the Kinahan organisation were in command, they did stay back and let them as such control the cocaine coming into the country. But you can see how opportunistic they are as the Kinahan organisation is beginning to dismantle, and as I suppose their focus is on other markets. The Kinahan sort of top command has very little interest in the Irish market anymore.
Yes.
They are still pumping stuff. It may start out as their product, but they themselves aren't really interested in.
No, they're not controlling the hand. And there are other routes, and you can see some of these other routes with the Turkish gangs, and some of this cocaine was being brought into the Balkans And while the Turkish gangs had the history of bringing the heroin, they were bringing it through the Balkan states as well. And apparently they have become more involved in moving cocaine then through kind of those Central European countries like France, like Germany, like Austria, places like that. So yeah, you can see these other routes are springing up. We've also had a number of cases recently where UK gangs, it's come before the courts, one of them involving a kind of a guy called Ryan Fitzpatrick, where you see these UK gangs who are moving cannabis into Ireland as well. So there is a vacuum, and that vacuum is being filled by other organisations who maybe operate slightly differently, but there's still there's huge money to be made in cocaine. There's just no doubt about it. And £8 million would have serviced a large part of that market.
I was just having a quick look while you were talking there about the amount of these sort of licensed aerodromes, they're called, in Ireland. And Abbeytrule is actually there, County Longford. There's one in County Meath. There's a number of them in Cork, Mayo, Offaly, Galway, Limerick, Kildare, Kilkenny, Tipperary, Wicklow and Meath.
Yeah. Like it is. Yeah, I mean, you just don't hear about it, do you?
Then there's other airfields, Abbeyfield Aerodrome in Limerick, Trim, more in Limerick, Fingal. You don't hear about any of these. There's loads of them in Kildare, Tipperary. Obviously, we've our two military, and then closed are quite a few of them as well. Like how are they being financed, those private?
Well, look, I mean, I'm sure
there's hobbyists, obviously.
Yeah, there's hobbyists and there's wealthy people in this country. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of multimillionaires in this country that aren't necessarily household names. And there are hobbyists, people that fly. There's people that can afford to fly private jets. It does seem a lot of them. I don't know anybody with a private jet myself. But obviously, no matter what transport routes exist, there'll be people who will look to exploit it for illicit purposes. But you have to think that the majority of the focus of the drugs investigations are on things coming in here by boat and by containers, definitely.
Well, Gilchrist is just yet another story of, in a way, of an opportunist seeing quick money.
Is he a cocaine cowboy? Is he?
He is a cocaine cowboy, a little bit. We don't see sort of a huge amount of guys of that age going into it, but there could be all sorts of reasons in the background. Opportunistic. Perhaps he was doing it for a lot longer than he was discovered. He seemed fairly cool and comfortable as regards, for a guy who told the court, it wasn't accepted, of course, that he had been a knock came to his door. Two men told him he was going to fly in an airplane and or else something would happen to an associate of his. But like he seemed very cool, and he had his black Alfa Romeo there waiting to load up and drive off with the cocaine.
Yeah, I mean, you also heard some evidence from the guards about text messages they intercepted where he was communicating with a guy called Sean and a guy called Niall.
Oh,
not myself.
Are you sure?
No, I move my drugs in a different manner.
Yeah.
But no, I don't move drugs. No, I mean, but even the texts don't sound like that aggressive, you know, because Sean texts Gilchrist saying there's a lot of guys around and to be careful, in a warning that prompted Gilchrist to just reply, okay. So, it doesn't seem that...
okay, so.
Yeah, and a minute later, a second message is sent to Gilchrist's phone and he's advised there might be better at other spots as the aircraft came into land. So obviously maybe they don't have to land there, maybe they can move their flight, but they obviously, there was a communication there that maybe didn't imply it was all threats and violence.
Well, I'll tell you what, my experience, but limited though it is, of this cocaine underworld is that most groupings don't just trust anybody with their coke. You know what I mean? They certainly wouldn't trust usually. It's also easier to have somebody working with you than to threaten them and have them terrified and, in a position where they could do anything, or that they would be quite tempted maybe to call in the police.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well that the family as an organisation have always tried to look for to lean on these people without massive criminal profiles. I mean, obviously the Kinnan cartel leaned on a lot of people who were very well known, both publicly and to Gardaí. But if you look at a lot of the major seizures of the family, they really focused sometimes on these guys that were very, drug addicts at a very low level. But they tended to lean on people like that, I think, to make these operations for the obvious reason that they weren't heavily on the Garda radar already. And Gilchrist certainly would fit that profile of somebody who wasn't.
Well, Walter Mitty's going to have to learn to keep his head down in prison for the next few years.
I wonder, is the term Walter Mitty ever going to have to stop being used? Do people even remember the origin of it?
I was
younger
going
generation.
to ask you about the origin. I was going to start out by asking you about the origin of Walter Mitty, and then I decided no, because you'd think that was a stupid question. So go on.
No, but
what is the origin of Walter Mitty?
It was a book, wasn't it, about a guy who sort of I think he was I don't even remember this exactly, but wasn't he an office worker?
The Secret Life of Walter Mitty.
Secret Life of Walter Mitty, and he was an office worker, and a book was written where in his head he was performing all these heroic acts while going around his day-to-day dull job. But I think the term has survived longer than the
Secret Life of Walter Mitty was first published in the New Yorker.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
In 1939, and then a book, My World and Welcome to It, in 1942. And of course, there has been movies made about it.
Yeah.
But he is a mild-mannered man with a vivid fantasy life, and he imagines himself as a wartime pilot, an emergency room surgeon, and a devil-may-care killer.
While he's going around his boring office job, filing papers, I think.
Exactly, exactly. So, okay, we'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.